Hello and welcome to a new episode of Another History of the World. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the US Civil War and emancipation. For most people, US history begins with the 102 passengers on the Mayflower ship, which landed in 1620. But actually a year earlier, records show 20 enslaved people from the African continent were brought to the British colonies. The transatlantic slave trade and the plantation society was the foundation of modern America and propped up the market capitalist system of the modern world. 60% of the 10 million African enslaved people were brought to the American colonies before the slave trade was banned by Congress in 1808. Crucially, not the same as banning slavery. By 1860, 13% of the population were black enslaved people. The abolition of enslaved peoples did not happen in a vacuum. Enslaved peoples had been revolting and agitating in both explicit and underground ways. By the spring of 1861, conflicts that had been intensifying between the North and the South over the course of 4 decades erupted into civil war. 11 southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. This was triggered by Abraham Lincoln's election, but the Civil War at its outset was not really a war to abolish slavery. Lincoln actually wanted to preserve the Union, knowing few would support a war against slavery. Some historians suggest he was worried the British would support the South and recognise the South as a separate entity. There was also a worry about getting more people to fight for the Union cause, and so there were a lot of political motives behind Lincoln's decisions. But Lincoln was undoubtedly pressured as well. There were thousands of formerly enslaved people moving north, put into what the Union called contraband camps, or what we now call freedmen's villages. They pushed to join in the army to play a role in terms of providing their labour for the Union, and they began to force the country and Lincoln to see the political military benefit from having more people become part of the war effort for the North. So enslaved people took their fate into their own hands and really forced the federal government to create policy. After the Union victory at Antietam in September, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and on January the 1st, 1863, he made it official that enslaved people within any state shall be thenceforth and forever free. Lincoln justified his decision as a wartime measure, so he didn't free enslaved people in the border states who were loyal to the Union, which angered many abolitionists. Slavery was truly ended when the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, which is honoured with Juneteenth. By freeing some 3 million enslaved people, the Emancipation Proclamation deprived the Confederacy of the bulk of its labour forces, put international public opinion strongly on the Union side. 186,000 black soldiers joined the Union Army, and 38,000 lost their lives by the time war ended in 1865. But the thing is, Lincoln's goal was not the abolition of slavery, but rather the preservation of the Union. If that meant keeping slaves in bondage everywhere, then he would support and practice exactly that. And this non-abolitionist stance is reflected in the text of the Emancipation Proclamation. He wrote in a letter, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It's not either to save or to destroy slavery. What I do about slavery and the coloured race, I do because it helps to save the Union." Essentially, the proclamation in the preliminary version said that if your state seizes its rebellion against the Union, you can keep your slaves. If a slave escaped to an area controlled by the Union, all a southern slave owner had to do was show up, give an oath, no evidence required, that he was the lawful owner of that slave, and swear that he'd never taken up arms against the Union, and then here's your slave back. So the Emancipation Proclamation didn't outlaw slavery anywhere. It declared current slaves in those areas to be free, in areas where the Union had no control. So it essentially freed them in word only, and was largely a symbolic gesture. An emancipation, what that really meant is not exactly clear-cut. The Reconstruction that followed laid the foundation for the organisation of new segregated institutions, white supremacist ideologies, legal rationalizations, extra-legal violence, and everyday racial terror, which further widened the racial divide. Others have pointed out that the end of the war left black Americans free, but their status undetermined, with the passing of codes to prevent black people from being truly free. And the effects of this violence in the slave economy are still felt in corporal punishment today. So although Lincoln is often lauded for ending slavery, we really have to scrutinise primary sources and see beyond what history gets written by the conquerors.